Hey guys, tonight, I want you to imagine an evening with nothing to distract you. No television glowing in the corner. No background noise filling the room. No screen telling you what to watch, when to laugh, or when the day is supposed to end. For most of history, evenings were not entertainment. They were endurance. A slow, quiet stretch of time where people simply waited for night to pass, and for their bodies to finally give in to rest. After sunset, the world did not offer much. Light faded, work slowed, conversation thinned, and people were left alone with their thoughts in a way that feels almost unfamiliar today. There was no television to signal comfort, no shared shows, no background voices to soften silence, just rooms growing darker, hours growing longer, and families learning how to sit with boredom, fatigue, and one another. Tonight's story is about those evenings, the ones spent by firelight, by dim lamps, by habit rather than choice. It's about how people filled time when time did not hurry them, and how night felt when there was nothing to escape into. So, as you settle in, lower the lights and let your room grow quiet. And if calm, slow history like this genuinely helps you unwind at night, not because you feel obligated, but because it actually brings you rest, you might consider subscribing. Now, let's step into an evening before television and allow it to unfold slowly. Evenings before television did not begin with relaxation. They began with exhaustion. By the time the sun lowered itself toward the horizon, most bodies were already carrying the full weight of the day. Muscles were tired not from choice, but from necessity. Work had consumed daylight, and what remained of the evening was not leisure, but recovery. The transition from day to evening was gradual. There was no single moment when work clearly ended and rest clearly began. Instead, tasks slowly lost urgency. Movements became slower. Voices softened. The body signaled, quietly but firmly, that it could not continue at the same pace. Light was the first thing to change. As daylight faded, the world narrowed, details disappeared, colors dulled, shadows lengthened across rooms and streets alike. People noticed this not as something poetic, but as a practical limitation. Less light meant fewer tasks could be done safely or efficiently. Indoors, lamps were prepared carefully. Candles were trimmed. Oil was measured. Firelight was adjusted rather than fully renewed. Light was precious, not decorative. It existed to make the evening possible, not enjoyable. Once light was established, the pace of the household shifted again. The most demanding labor was already finished. What remained were smaller, quieter tasks, cleaning tools, folding clothing, preparing what little could be prepared for the next day. These were done without urgency, often in near silence. Conversation during this time was minimal. People had already spoken enough during the day. Words felt heavy in the evening. Silence was not awkward, it was expected. The absence of constant noise allowed thoughts to drift without direction. Without television, evenings were not structured by programming. There was no schedule to follow, no shared moment. Everyone oriented themselves toward. Time felt open, but not free. It stretched without offering options. Families often gathered in the same room, not for entertainment, but for warmth and light. Heat and illumination were centralized. This proximity was practical before it was social. People sat together because resources demanded it. What they did during these hours varied little. Some repaired clothing, others prepared tools. Children played quietly, often repeating the same simple games. Reading occurred when literacy and light allowed it, but even then it was limited. Eyes tired quickly in dim conditions. Boredom was not avoided, it was endured. There was no cultural expectation that every free moment should be filled with stimulation. Waiting was a skill learned early. Sitting with nothing to do was considered normal. The body, still recovering from labor, resisted sudden activity. Movements were careful. Stretching was unconscious. People shifted in chairs, adjusted posture, relieved pressure from aching joints. Comfort was sought slowly, without expectation of achieving it fully. Sound behaved differently in the evening. With fewer activities underway, small noises became noticeable. The crackle of fire, the scrape of fabric, footsteps outside. These sounds were not distractions. They were part of the atmosphere. Darkness pressed closer as time passed. Lamps did not eliminate it. They only carved out small islands of visibility. Beyond those boundaries, the room dissolved into shadow. The mind adjusted to this limitation without resistance. Children grew restless before they grew sleepy. Energy lingered unevenly. Adults corrected gently, conserving their own energy. Discipline softened as fatigue deepened. The evening was not the time for conflict. Meals, if taken in the evening, were simple and repetitive. Leftovers, bread, warm liquids. Eating was functional. It restored warmth more than pleasure. Appetite faded as tiredness increased. After eating, activity decreased further. People remained seated longer. Movement felt optional rather than required. The body began preparing itself for rest long before sleep actually arrived. There was no expectation that evenings should feel rewarding. They were transitional, a space between effort and sleep, a time to slow down, not to feel fulfilled. Without television to provide distraction, people became more aware of themselves. Thoughts resurfaced, worries replayed, memories returned. The mind had fewer places to hide. Some evenings felt heavy with unspoken concerns, financial strain, health worries, uncertainty about the future. These thoughts were rarely discussed openly. They circulated quietly, contained within individuals. Others felt empty rather than heavy. Time stretched with nothing to fill it. This emptiness was not always uncomfortable. Sometimes it was simply neutral, a pause between demands. As the evening progressed, yawns appeared without comment, eyes strained against low light. Reading ended not at a chapter break, but when vision failed. Tasks stopped when hands lost precision. The body gradually signaled that it was ready to withdraw. Not suddenly, not decisively, just enough to suggest that continuing would require more effort than it was worth. This was the nature of evenings before television. They were not curated, not optimized, not designed to entertain. They existed as a consequence of fatigue, darkness, and routine. People did not ask how to spend their evenings. The question did not arise. Evenings simply happened, unfolding slowly, predictably, until there was nothing left to do but wait for night to deepen further. And as the room grew quieter and light weakened, the day loosened its grip at last. Once the day had fully loosened its grip, people were left with a stretch of time that felt unfamiliar in its openness. Evening before television was not empty, but it was unstructured. There was no external voice guiding attention, no fixed point to gather around. Time existed, waiting to be filled slowly, carefully, and often repeatedly. Most evenings began with the same small acts. Hands returned to work, not because work was demanded, but because stillness felt uncomfortable at first. Clothing was mended again and again. Tears that had already been stitched once were reinforced. Buttons were checked, loosened, tightened, replaced. These tasks were done without urgency, guided more by habit than necessity. Repairing objects was common. Tools were cleaned, even if they were not immediately needed. Wooden handles were smoothed with cloth. Metal was wiped of residue from the day. These actions served little immediate purpose, but they created a sense of continuation. The day had not ended abruptly. It faded. Children were given quiet tasks, partly to keep them occupied, partly to teach patience. They were asked to sit, to watch, to hold objects, to repeat simple motions. Restlessness was not indulged. Learning to wait was considered a skill. When conversation occurred, it was sparse and practical. Topics returned again and again to the same concerns: weather, work, food, small updates that had already been discussed earlier in the day were repeated without frustration. Repetition was normal. It filled time. Stories, when told, were familiar. Tales repeated over years, sometimes decades. Details shifted slightly with each retelling, but the structure remained intact. These stories were not meant to surprise. They were meant to comfort through familiarity. Reading, when possible, happened in short bursts. Light strained the eyes. Pages were turned slowly. Often the same lines were read again, either because attention drifted or because the text was already well known. Reading was not immersive, it was intermittent. Some evenings included quiet games, simple board games, cards, or word-based diversions that required minimal light. These were played slowly, often without enthusiasm. Winning did not matter. Participation mattered. Music, if present, was subdued. Instruments were played softly, not for performance, but for presence. Familiar melodies returned night after night. There was no pressure to innovate. Sound existed to mark time gently. Many evenings passed with little visible activity at all. People sat. They leaned back. They stared into firelight. Watching flames shift and settle required no effort. Thoughts drifted without direction. Firelight itself became a form of entertainment. The way it cast shadows, the way it changed color, the way it responded to small movements of air. This observation was passive, almost meditative. Fatigue deepened as the evening progressed. Bodies that had endured long hours of labor began to resist engagement. Even simple tasks felt heavier. Hands slowed, backs curved further into chairs. The body gradually reclaimed priority over the mind. Without television to absorb attention, people became acutely aware of physical sensation. A stiff joint, an aching shoulder, a persistent chill. These sensations were not distractions. They were reminders of the day's demands. Waiting became more pronounced. Waiting for sleep. Waiting for night to deepen. Waiting for the moment when it felt acceptable to withdraw from activity entirely. This waiting was not anxious, it was resigned. Children were often the first to show signs of sleepiness. They fidgeted, then stilled. Heads leaned against shoulders. Adults noticed quietly, without announcing it. Bedtime was not enforced sharply. It emerged naturally. As children were guided away, the evening thinned further. Fewer voices remained, fewer movements. The room felt larger as occupants left. Silence expanded. Adults lingered longer, not because they were less tired, but because responsibility delayed rest. Locks were checked, fires were adjusted. The next day was considered briefly, mentally, without discussion. Some evenings brought reflection. The quiet invited memory. People revisited moments from earlier years, replaying decisions without resolution. Regret surfaced quietly. So did acceptance. Loneliness was present even in shared rooms. Proximity did not guarantee connection. Silence existed both between and within people. This was not always painful. It was simply part of being awake without distraction. Evenings were rarely joyful, but they were rarely distressing either. They existed in a neutral emotional space, a holding pattern between effort and rest. Time passed slowly, but not unbearably. Without constant stimulation, minutes stretched, hours felt long. Yet there was no pressure to fill them completely. Empty time was allowed to remain empty. Eventually, activity diminished to almost nothing. People shifted less. Speech faded entirely. The fire settled into embers. Light weakened. At this point, the evening was no longer about passing time. It was about yielding to it. The body prepared to withdraw. The mind followed reluctantly. There was no announcement that the evening had ended. No final moment of entertainment. Just a gradual reduction of presence until only stillness remained. This was how people spent their evenings before television. Not with anticipation, not with distraction, but with endurance. They moved through time slowly, filling it imperfectly, until sleep claimed what effort could no longer sustain. And as the last light dimmed, the evening dissolved completely, leaving only night behind. As the evening stretched further, it began to lose its shape. What had once been a series of small activities slowly dissolved into stillness. The room did not change dramatically. Furniture remained where it was. Light still flickered weakly. But something inside the space shifted. The evening stopped offering distraction and began demanding patience. This was the hour when people stopped pretending to be occupied. Hands rested longer in laps. Eyes drifted without focus. The body no longer looked for tasks. It waited, and waiting, without entertainment, felt heavier than labor ever had. Silence during this time was not sudden. It arrived in layers. First, conversation ended. Then movement slowed. Eventually, even small sounds became rare. What remained was a quiet that felt thick, as if it filled the room rather than simply surrounding it. People sat with this silence because there was nowhere else to go. Outside was dark. Inside was dim. There was no alternative space to retreat into. The evening closed in gently, removing options one by one. Shared rooms became more intimate during these hours, not because people moved closer, but because awareness sharpened. Breathing became noticeable. Shifting weight on a chair sounded louder than before. Even the smallest movement carried presence. Without television to absorb attention, the mind wandered freely. Thoughts returned that had been postponed during the day. Conversations replayed. Mistakes resurfaced. Worries stretched themselves out, taking advantage of the quiet. This mental activity was not dramatic. It did not arrive as panic. It arrived as persistence. Thoughts repeated themselves slowly, circling familiar concerns without resolution. Financial worries were common. The cost of food, the condition of tools, the uncertainty of work. These thoughts did not escalate quickly. They settled in, staying just uncomfortable enough to remain present. Health concerns followed. A lingering ache, a cough that had not faded, fatigue that felt deeper than usual. Without distraction, the body's signals grew louder. Sensations that were ignored during the day demanded attention at night. People rarely spoke these worries aloud. Evening was not a time for problem solving. It was a time for endurance. Words felt insufficient. Silence felt more appropriate. Children, if still awake, sensed this shift. Their energy dropped unevenly. Moments of restlessness alternated with sudden stillness. Adults corrected them less during this hour. Fatigue softened authority. As children were finally guided to bed, the space changed again. The room felt emptier. Chairs were left unoccupied. Light seemed weaker without movement around it. Adults remained behind, often sitting longer than necessary. Rising felt effortful. The body resisted change. Remaining seated felt easier than standing, even when sleep was desired. Firelight continued to draw attention. Flames were watched without intention. The mind drifted alongside the movement of light. This watching did not entertain. It calmed without fully soothing. Time during this period felt elastic. Minutes stretched unevenly. There was no way to measure them precisely. Without clocks illuminated, people relied on instinct. The body sensed when night had deepened enough to justify sleep. Some evenings felt longer than others. On nights following particularly exhausting days, the body surrendered quickly. On others, restlessness lingered. The mind refused to quiet itself. Loneliness often surfaced during these hours. Even in shared households, emotional distance grew noticeable. People sat together but separately. Thoughts diverged. Silence emphasized separation rather than connection. This loneliness was rarely named. It was not considered unusual. Life was not expected to provide constant companionship. Solitude existed even among others. Memory grew louder in the absence of distraction. Faces from earlier years returned. Voices echoed faintly. Events long past resurfaced without invitation. These memories were not always comforting. They simply appeared. Regret, too, found space here. Decisions replayed slowly, without judgment, without resolution. There was no expectation that reflection would lead to change. It was simply something the mind did when left alone. As night deepened further, the body began to assert itself more strongly. Eyelids grew heavy, muscles relaxed unevenly, posture collapsed inward. The body prepared itself for withdrawal. Still, sleep did not arrive immediately. The space between fatigue and rest stretched out. People lingered in this state, neither fully awake nor asleep. This waiting was one of the most defining features of evenings before television. There was no quick transition, no signal that told the body it was time. Sleep had to be approached gradually. Eventually, practical concerns forced movement. Lamps were dimmed or extinguished. Fires were banked carefully. Doors were checked. These tasks were performed slowly, deliberately, without conversation. Walking through dark rooms required memory. The body navigated familiar paths without sight. This movement felt intimate, almost ritualistic. Bedrooms were not destinations of comfort. They were functional spaces. Beds awaited, imperfect and cold. The act of lying down was not indulgent. It was necessary. Once in bed, the waiting continued. Darkness deepened completely. The room dissolved into sound and sensation. Breathing, fabric, distant noise, these replaced sight entirely. Sleep arrived unevenly. Some fell quickly. Others lay awake for long stretches. Thoughts persisted. The body shifted repeatedly, seeking a position that offered relief rather than comfort. Night before television did not promise escape. It offered rest eventually, but only after patience was exhausted. Sleep was not taken, it was surrendered to, and so the evening ended, not with satisfaction, but with quiet acceptance. Another day had passed, another night had begun, and the long wait continued, now in darkness. Sleep, once it arrived, never arrived as a single moment. It unfolded gradually, like fog settling across a field. The body surrendered first, muscles loosening one by one, while the mind lingered behind, still lightly awake. Breath slowed, limbs grew heavy, yet awareness hovered quietly, not fully willing to disappear. Sleep before electricity was not a switch being turned off. It was a slow negotiation between exhaustion and consciousness, repeated every night without much thought. Darkness during these hours was complete and consuming, not the softened dusk of evening, but a depth that erased edges entirely. Rooms no longer appeared as spaces with walls and corners. They became enclosed pockets of warmth, breath, and scent. Without light, vision lost relevance. Sound and touch replaced sight as the primary senses guiding awareness. People learned the night through listening rather than looking. The house itself remained active even while its occupants slept. Wood responded to cooling temperatures, contracting with faint creaks and sighs. Beams shifted slightly under their own weight. Floors settled. These sounds were familiar, never alarming. They were reminders that the structure, like the people inside it, adjusted constantly to the passing hours. Silence was never total. It breathed and moved alongside those resting within it. Sleep in this era was rarely uninterrupted. People drifted in and out of rest without judgment or anxiety. Brief waking was expected, not feared. Eyes might open without the body fully stirring. Thought returned slowly, as if surfacing from water. Time during these moments felt vague and unimportant. There was no pressure to track minutes or hours. The night belonged to no schedule. In shared sleeping spaces, awareness extended beyond the self. Someone nearby shifted their weight. A blanket rustled softly. A quiet cough broke the stillness and faded. These sounds registered faintly, then dissolved back into sleep. The presence of others was constant, even when unnoticed. Rest was communal, shaped by shared breath and shared silence. Children slept differently from adults. Their rest was lighter, less settled. Limbs moved suddenly. Quiet murmurs escaped without meaning. Adults, even while deeply tired, remained half attentive. Years of responsibility trained them to listen, even in sleep. The night was not a time of full detachment. Awareness lingered, ready to respond if needed. Outside sounds carried far in the absence of constant noise. A distant cartwheel, a footstep on packed earth, an animal moving through darkness. These noises did not trigger alarm. They were absorbed as part of the larger rhythm of night. The world did not disappear after sunset. It merely slowed. Its movements stretched thin across the hours. Fear existed, but it was rarely dramatic. Darkness was not unfamiliar. It had been present every night of a person's life. Stillness did not suggest danger by default. People accepted the night as a necessary state rather than a threat. Unease surfaced quietly, often without a clear cause, and faded just as gently. Dreams during these hours were vivid and strangely detailed, Without constant stimulation during waking life, the mind carried unresolved thoughts into sleep. Memories blended easily with imagination. Faces appeared without explanation. Places shifted without logic. Dreams did not feel separate from life. They felt like another form of thinking, occurring in darkness rather than daylight. Nightmares were not uncommon, particularly during periods of hardship or illness. Anxiety found space in the quiet, yet dreams were rarely discussed openly. Interpretation was not a daily habit. Dreams were endured, not examined. They passed with the night and were absorbed into waking routine without ceremony. Waking after the first stretch of sleep was common enough to be unremarkable. A person might open their eyes and lie still, breathing slowly, not yet fully present. The body felt heavy, warmth partially lost. The mind drifted without urgency. There was no expectation to return to sleep immediately. Night was long, and there was no rush to escape it. Some used this waking time for quiet habits. Soft prayers repeated from memory, not formal or dramatic, but rhythmic and calming. Others listened to the house, grounding themselves in familiar sounds. Words spoken aloud were rare. Silence held more comfort than conversation during these hours. In certain households, people rose briefly from bed. A fire was checked to ensure it had not gone out completely. A door was tested. Animals were listened for. These movements were slow and deliberate, performed with half-sleeping bodies. Returning to bed felt heavier than rising. Cold settled quickly against exposed skin. As people lay down again, sleep returned in stages. The second rest often felt deeper, less troubled by thought. Awareness thinned more completely. Dreams softened. The body sank further into stillness, surrendering again to fatigue. Cold remained a constant presence throughout the night. Even during warmer months, darkness brought damp air. Bodies curled inward instinctively, conserving warmth. People slept clothed, layered, prepared for chill rather than comfort. Beds offered little insulation, but familiarity compensated for discomfort. Mattresses shifted beneath weight, uneven and imperfect. Hardness reminded sleepers of their physical bodies, even while resting. Despite this, muscles adapted. Fatigue dulled irritation. Sleep continued, not because conditions were ideal, but because the body required it. Time remained unmeasured and abstract. Without illuminated clocks, hours passed unnoticed. People sensed progression intuitively. The body tracked night by temperature, by depth of sleep, by the quality of dreams. Awareness of time existed without numbers. At some point, the night reached its deepest stillness. This was the quietest hour, when even animals paused. Wind softened, movement slowed further. The world seemed suspended. Waking during this period felt strange, almost unsettling, as if consciousness had arrived too early. Thoughts surfaced briefly in this stillness, unanswered questions, lingering worries. The mind tested wakefulness, then retreated again. There was nothing to resolve in darkness. Sleep reclaimed awareness slowly. Eventually, the balance shifted again. Night loosened its hold. The body sensed change before light appeared. Sleep grew lighter. Dreams thinned. Awareness returned in fragments rather than fully. Morning had not yet arrived, but night was already retreating. This in-between state lingered quietly. People rested within it without naming it, suspended between darkness and return. Sleep before television did not divide neatly into categories. It flowed continuously, adjusting to the natural arc of night rather than resisting it. There was no concept of optimizing rest. There was only endurance and adaptation. The long middle of the night passed without being marked or recorded. It was not counted. It was lived through. People moved through it instinctively, shaped by habit rather than intention. And so, without announcement or conclusion, this portion of night faded. The world prepared itself again for movement, for labor, for repetition. Sleep released its grip gradually, just as it had taken hold. The night did not end suddenly. It simply thinned, allowing the next phase of life to begin. Waking before sunrise was not a decision. It happened gradually, without instruction or resistance. The body emerged from sleep in stages, guided by temperature, light, and habit, rather than alarms. Awareness returned softly, as if the mind tested the day before, fully accepting it. People lay still for a time, conserving warmth, listening to the house breathe, knowing that rest was ending even if movement had not yet begun. Darkness remained, but it had changed. It felt thinner, less absolute. The air carried a faint sense of direction. Night no longer pressed inward. Instead, it slowly withdrew, leaving behind a quiet expectancy. Those awake sensed this shift instinctively. Morning was approaching, though light had not yet arrived. Beds released their occupants reluctantly. Warmth had to be abandoned. Blankets were set aside, slowly, often with hesitation. Bodies, stiff from labor, protested movement. Joints resisted. Muscles tightened in the cold air. Rising was not energizing. It was necessary. Rooms at this hour felt larger and emptier. Without lamplight, furniture remained invisible, known only through memory. Movement was cautious and practiced. Hands reached for familiar surfaces. Feet found the floor carefully. Every action was guided by repetition rather than sight. Sound returned before light, the soft movement of others waking, a distant cough, the creak of a floorboard under weight. These noises marked the transition from rest to labor. The house began to wake as a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. Fire was often the first concern. Without heat, nothing else followed easily. Embers from the night before were coaxed back into flame with patience. Breath and movement worked together. Sparks were encouraged, not forced. This task required time and attention, anchoring the morning in physical effort. As the fire returned, the room changed subtly. Shadows shifted. Warmth spread unevenly. The day began its slow formation. There was no clear beginning, only gradual assembly. Water was fetched or warmed. Simple food was prepared. These tasks followed one another in familiar sequence. The body moved through them without conscious planning. Morning was not a time for reflection. It was a time for preparation. Conversation remained minimal. Voices were low, often unnecessary. Shared silence felt natural at this hour. Words came later, once light had fully arrived. For now, the morning belonged to routine rather than expression. Children woke more reluctantly. Sleep clung to them longer. They were guided gently into movement, coaxed rather than commanded. Adults understood this resistance. Fatigue was universal. No one expected eagerness. The absence of artificial light shaped this time deeply. Without illumination, mornings were slower by necessity. Tasks waited for visibility. Pace followed daylight rather than desire. The world revealed itself gradually, allowing bodies to adjust without shock. Outside, the world mirrored the interior. Darkness softened. The sky shifted almost imperceptibly. Animals stirred. Sounds multiplied quietly. Morning announced itself through accumulation rather than declaration. People dressed in layers, preparing for cold that lingered even as night retreated. Clothing was functional, repetitive, familiar. Dressing was not expressive, it was protective. Emotion at this hour remained muted. There was little room for anticipation or dread. The day had not yet demanded anything specific. Morning existed as a threshold, not a destination. Fatigue did not vanish with waking. It settled into the body, accepted as constant. Energy was conserved carefully. Movements were economical. No effort was wasted. The body adjusted slowly. Breath deepened. Circulation increased. The mind followed behind, catching up to physical motion rather than leading it. As light finally entered the room, it revealed familiar spaces without surprise. Nothing had changed overnight. Objects waited where they had been left. This consistency offered quiet reassurance. The world remained stable, even if effort was required to move through it again. Morning before electricity was not optimistic. It was practical. It did not promise improvement. It simply allowed continuation. People stepped fully into the day without ceremony. The transition was complete only when work resumed. Rest ended not with clarity, but with obligation. And so the cycle continued, not driven by motivation, but by necessity. Night released its hold reluctantly. Day accepted the body without kindness or cruelty. This was waking before modern convenience. Not abrupt, not gentle, simply inevitable. Once the morning fully established itself, the day did not begin with urgency. There was no sharp dividing line between waking and working. Instead, the body slid into activity the same way it had slid out of sleep. Movements remained measured. Breath stayed slow. The mind followed the body, not the other way around. Energy was not summoned. It was rationed. Light now filled the rooms, clearly, revealing familiar wear. Floors showed their scuffs. Walls carried marks from years of contact. Objects appeared exactly where they had been left, unchanged and dependable. This consistency mattered. It reduced mental effort. Nothing needed rediscovering. Work began close to home. Tasks that had waited for light were taken up quietly. Cleaning, mending, sorting, preparing. These were not framed as chores, but as continuation. Hands moved automatically. Muscles remembered patterns long after thought disengaged. Conversation increased slightly, but remained functional. Words served purpose rather than expression. Instructions were brief. Responses were minimal. Silence returned easily between exchanges. No one felt compelled to fill space with sound. The absence of entertainment shaped attention profoundly. There was nothing competing for focus. No voices demanding reaction. No images pulling thought away. Awareness stayed anchored to the immediate task. This did not create calm. It created steadiness. Fatigue did not disappear with daylight. It accompanied the body into work. People understood their limits instinctively. Pace adjusted without discussion. Slower movement was not weakness, it was preservation. Meals during this part of the day were simple and unremarkable. Food served function before pleasure. Eating was efficient, not ceremonial. Energy was restored just enough to continue, not enough to feel renewed. Time passed unevenly, without clocks dominating attention. Hours were sensed through light, hunger, and bodily strain. The sun's position mattered more than numbers. The body tracked progression internally. Outside labor followed similar rhythms. Fields, roads, workshops, all moved at a pace set by daylight and endurance. There was no concept of productivity optimization. Work expanded to fill available energy, then stopped. Sound during the day was sparse but present. Tools struck surfaces. Footsteps crossed ground. Voices carried briefly, then fell away. Noise did not accumulate. It existed moment by moment. Breaks were taken without formal scheduling. A body paused when it needed to. Stretching, sitting, leaning. These moments were not named as rest. They were embedded within labor itself. Children were folded into this rhythm early. Observation preceded participation. Small tasks were assigned without explanation. Learning occurred through repetition rather than instruction. Attention grew slowly. Emotion during the day remained subdued. There was little room for introspection. Mental energy was conserved. Feelings existed, but they were bounded. The day demanded presence, not reflection. As light shifted toward midday, energy peaked briefly. Movements became slightly faster. Conversation loosened marginally. This was not excitement. It was alignment between body and environment. Yet, even at its strongest, energy remained limited. Overexertion carried consequences. People learned restraint through experience. Fatigue was remembered. The lack of artificial stimulation prevented emotional spikes. No sudden excitement, no dramatic lows. Mood remained flat, stable, survivable. This steadiness supported endurance. Tasks repeated endlessly. Familiarity reduced mental strain. The mind drifted while the body continued. Thought wandered without disrupting movement. Work became almost meditative in its repetition. As afternoon approached, subtle decline began. Muscles stiffened, breath shortened, small aches accumulated. These changes were accepted without complaint. They were expected. There was no anticipation of evening entertainment, no reward waiting. The only certainty was rest, eventually. This knowledge shaped effort carefully. Light softened again, shadows lengthened. The day did not announce its ending, but hinted at it gradually. Bodies responded before awareness fully caught up. Work slowed without instruction. Tools were set down deliberately. Movements grew heavier. Conversation thinned again. The house prepared itself for night long before darkness arrived. This part of the day was not marked by achievement. Nothing was completed in a final sense. Tasks paused where they always paused. Continuation was assumed. The absence of spectacle allowed life to feel continuous rather than segmented. There were no sharp transitions, only gradual shifts. Fatigue now layered over itself. Physical tiredness blended with mental dulling. This was not exhaustion yet. It was preparation for it. As evening approached, the body already anticipated darkness. Movements became conservative. Energy was guarded. The mind retreated inward. This was how days before television sustained themselves, not through motivation, but through rhythm, not through stimulation, but through repetition. The day did not demand attention, it absorbed it, and slowly, without announcement, it began to give way. As afternoon slipped toward evening, the change was felt before it was seen. Bodies sensed the shift earlier than the sky revealed it. Movements grew slower, not because work had ended, but because energy had begun to thin. Muscles no longer responded with the same willingness. Breath deepened again, heavier now, weighted by hours of repetition. The day had taken what it needed, and what remained was carefully guarded. Light softened across rooms and fields alike. Shadows lengthened quietly, stretching along walls and floors without drawing attention to themselves. There was no sudden dimming, no dramatic transition. The sun retreated slowly, allowing people time to adjust their expectations. Evening was not an event. It was a gradual loosening. Work did not stop immediately. Tasks were brought to natural pauses rather than conclusions. Tools were set aside where they would be found again. Nothing was put away with finality. The day was ending, but not in a way that suggested closure. Tomorrow would require the same motions. Inside the house, movement changed character. Actions became smaller, more deliberate. People conserved effort instinctively. Every unnecessary step was avoided. Energy was no longer spent freely. It was protected for the hours ahead. Conversation softened again. Voices lowered without instruction. Words became fewer, carrying only what was necessary. Silence returned easily between exchanges. There was comfort in not speaking. The day had already required enough. Children's energy flickered unevenly during this time. Some grew restless, resisting the approach of night. Others faded quickly, their bodies responding to the dimming light more honestly. Adults watched without comment. Fatigue was understood, not corrected. The absence of artificial lighting shaped the pace profoundly. As visibility declined, so did activity. Tasks that required precision were abandoned first. What remained were simple, familiar motions that could be performed without full attention. Firelight began to matter again. Flames were encouraged, adjusted carefully. Light was not wasted. Each candle, each ember carried value. The room narrowed visually, pulling attention inward. Darkness reclaimed corners slowly. Evening meals were simple and functional. Food restored just enough strength to carry bodies into night. Eating was quiet, unhurried. There was no performance, no distraction. Taste was secondary to sustenance. After eating, people did not scatter. They remained close, drawn together by limited light and shared fatigue. Chairs were occupied deliberately. Bodies rested where they could. Stillness increased. Hands found small tasks, mending, sorting, repairing. These actions filled time without demanding energy. Repetition soothed the mind. There was no expectation of enjoyment. Occupation itself was enough. Thoughts during this hour drifted differently. The mind no longer focused forward. Planning faded. Attention turned inward, toward memory and sensation. The day's impressions settled slowly, without being examined closely. Outside, the world quieted in layers. Animals withdrew. Human movement thinned. Sound became occasional rather than constant. Evening absorbed noise gently, leaving behind a broader stillness. Fatigue now sat openly in the body. It was not resisted. There was no concept of pushing through. Limits were respected because ignoring them carried consequences the next day. Children were guided toward rest gradually. There was no sharp bedtime signal. Sleep arrived unevenly. Eyes closed where they could. Bodies leaned, curled, surrendered when ready. Adults remained awake longer, though not more alert. Awareness dulled. Speech slowed further. The day's weight pressed evenly across shoulders and thoughts alike. This hour was not entertaining. It was transitional. It prepared the body for darkness without excitement or dread. Evening before television offered no escape from self. It allowed exhaustion to settle naturally. Firelight flickered, casting moving shadows that required no interpretation. People watched without thinking, letting vision soften. The mind followed suit. As night approached fully, the house grew quieter, not silent, but restrained. Sounds were contained, careful not to disturb those already slipping into rest. The day released its hold, slowly, reluctantly. It did not end, it dissolved. Evening did not offer relief in the modern sense. It offered permission to slow, to stop, expanding effort, to exist without output. And as darkness deepened, the body accepted what it had been moving toward since morning. Rest was coming. When darkness finally settled completely, it did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, filling the spaces that light had slowly abandoned. What remained visible earlier now dissolved into suggestion. Walls faded, corners disappeared. The house became something felt rather than seen. People adjusted without thinking. They had done this every night of their lives. Darkness was not an interruption. It was the natural continuation of the day. Firelight now held authority. Its glow was uneven, unstable, never reaching far. It shaped the room into a smaller world, one defined by proximity. Everything outside its reach became irrelevant. Attention narrowed, bodies gathered closer, not always intentionally, but because darkness encouraged it. Distance required effort. Nearness required none. Movement slowed further. Each action now carried consequence. A careless step could strike unseen furniture. A hurried motion could waste light or energy. People learned to move gently, deliberately, with memory guiding their hands more than sight. The body relied on habit more than awareness. Voices softened again, often dropping into near whispers. Sound carried differently in darkness. Even quiet words felt larger. Silence became preferred, not because of fear, but because it required nothing. Speaking spent energy. Listening did not. Thoughts also changed character. Without light, the mind turned inward more easily. Distractions fell away. There was nothing visual to occupy attention. Memory surfaced uninvited. Images replayed from earlier in the day, not sharply, but loosely, like impressions rather than scenes. Fatigue settled deeper into the body. Muscles no longer resisted gravity. Posture collapsed naturally. People leaned, slouched, rested without self-correction. There was no expectation of alertness. Wakefulness itself had grown thin. Hands remained active for some time, performing small, familiar tasks that did not demand precision. Repairing, folding, sorting. These motions were rhythmic, almost automatic. They gave the body something to do while the mind drifted elsewhere. Children responded differently to full darkness. Some grew quiet and withdrawn, surrendering quickly to sleep. Others became restless, unsettled by the loss of visual reassurance. Adults responded without urgency, understanding that resistance was temporary. There was no formal boundary between evening and night, no declared bedtime. Sleep arrived unevenly, person by person, without ceremony. Some closed their eyes where they sat. Others lingered, neither fully awake nor asleep. Firelight demanded attention. It had to be watched, adjusted, protected. Letting it die too early meant deeper cold and more effort later. Letting it burn too strongly wasted fuel. Balance mattered. This quiet responsibility anchored the night. Outside, the world receded further. Sounds thinned. Movement became rare. When noises did occur, they felt magnified against the stillness. A distant step, an animal calling briefly, wind touching surfaces. Each sound arrived alone, then vanished. Darkness did not encourage fear by default, but it gave space for it. Thoughts without resolution found room to expand. Worries returned quietly, not dramatically, simply persistently. Night offered no distraction from unease. Dreaminess crept into wakefulness. Thoughts lost structure. Attention wandered freely. People slipped in and out of semi-consciousness, sometimes without realizing it. Time blurred. Minutes and hours dissolved into a single stretch. Those who lay down did so slowly. Bodies lowered themselves carefully, mindful of cold surfaces. Blankets were pulled close. Clothing remained on. Warmth was guarded closely. Comfort was functional, not indulgent. The bed itself offered familiarity rather than luxury. Mattresses shifted. Surfaces were uneven, yet the body accepted them willingly. Fatigue outweighed irritation. Rest was not about comfort. It was about release. Breathing deepened once bodies settled. Rhythm replaced thought. Awareness faded in waves rather than disappearing entirely. The mind lingered near the surface, easily stirred. Sleep, when it came, arrived gently, not as escape, but as surrender. Consciousness loosened its grip gradually. Dreams formed slowly, blending seamlessly with memory and sensation. Even then, sleep remained light. Waking briefly was expected. Darkness encouraged listening even while resting. The house continued its quiet movements. The world did not disappear simply because eyes were closed. Night before television allowed no illusion of separation. Wakefulness and sleep overlapped freely. There was no pressure to remain unconscious. Rest occurred in layers. Thoughts surfaced intermittently. Faces appeared. Voices echoed faintly. The mind processed the day without direction. There was no effort to interpret or control this process. Cold returned periodically, creeping inward despite layers. Bodies adjusted instinctively. Blankets were shifted. Positions changed. Sleep continued around these movements. Privacy remained limited. Bodies shared space, breath, sound. Boundaries blurred naturally. This closeness was not questioned. It had always been so. At some point, the deepest darkness arrived. The hour when night felt thickest. Stillness pressed gently. Even those awake sensed it. Awareness sharpened briefly, then softened again. This was the hour most distant from both day and morning. Time felt suspended. The world seemed paused rather than asleep. For some, this hour carried unease. For others, it brought calm. There was no single experience. Night revealed inner states rather than creating them. Eventually, without announcement, the balance shifted again. Sleep deepened for some. Awareness retreated further. The body claimed what rest it could. Night continued, not as an event, but as a condition. It held people quietly, patiently, without demand. There was no attempt to optimize rest, no concern for duration or quality. Sleep occurred because exhaustion allowed it, not because it was planned. This was the final stage before full rest, the narrowing of awareness, the softening of thought, the gradual disappearance of self into darkness. And so the hours passed. Not quickly, not cleanly, but completely. At some point in the night, without anyone noticing the moment itself, sleep deepened. Awareness loosened its final grip. not suddenly, but with quiet reluctance. Thought thinned until it no longer formed sentences. The body sank further into stillness, no longer adjusting, no longer resisting. This was not escape. It was the body finally being allowed to stop negotiating. Breathing became slower, heavier, more deliberate. The rhythm settled into something ancient and automatic. Muscles softened fully now, releasing the tension that had carried them through the day. The mind drifted deeper, past memory, past worry, into a state without edges. This was the deepest part of the night, the hour when the world felt farthest from movement. Outside, even animals remained quiet. Wind softened, sound retreated. The house held still, as if respecting the weight of rest inside it. Dreams during this period were less vivid but more immersive. They did not feel like stories. They felt like states, sensations without explanation, familiar places without context. The mind processed what it could without language. For some, sleep remained fragmented. The body stirred occasionally, never fully waking. A shift in position, a shallow breath, a half-formed thought that dissolved before it could take shape. Rest continued around these interruptions without breaking. Others slipped into complete unconsciousness for the first time that night. This deeper sleep came not from comfort, but from exhaustion, finally overcoming awareness. The body claimed what it needed without permission. Time during these hours felt suspended. Night no longer moved forward. It simply existed. There was no sense of waiting, no anticipation, just presence without attention. Yet even here, sleep was never absolute. The body remained alert to change. A sudden sound could still reach awareness. A shift in temperature could still register. Survival instincts never fully disengaged. Children slept more deeply now. Their movements slowed, their breathing even. Adults remained lighter sleepers, conditioned by years of responsibility. Even in rest, they listened. Cold pressed inward again. Bodies responded instinctively, drawing closer, pulling coverings tighter. Sleep adapted rather than resisted. Rest continued despite discomfort. Privacy remained absent. Breath overlapped. Bodies shared space unconsciously. This closeness was neither comforting nor troubling. It simply was. As the night aged, the body began preparing for return without instruction. Hormones shifted. Temperature adjusted. Sleep grew lighter once more. Not abruptly, but subtly. Dreams thinned again. Awareness floated closer to the surface. The mind tested consciousness briefly, then sank back. This cycle repeated quietly. Eventually, the deepest darkness began to loosen. Not visually, but physically. The air changed slightly. The body sensed it first. Sleep lost some of its weight. This transition was gradual, barely noticeable. The night did not end. It softened. Thoughts returned in fragments. Sensation re-entered awareness. The body remained still, conserving warmth, but consciousness hovered nearby. No one announced morning. No signal was given. The cycle simply began again. Sleep before electricity did not conclude with satisfaction. It concluded with necessity. Rest ended because the world required participation again. The night had done what it could, and so awareness returned quietly, imperfectly, carrying fragments of dreams, fatigue, and memory into another day. This was how nights ended. Not cleanly, not completely, but enough to continue, enough to endure, enough to begin again.